In the beginning, Thorin created his YouTube channel, and the channel was without sponsorship and void of Skrilla, and an emptiness was within his wallet. And the spirit of Alpha Draft moved into the scene, and Thorin said, "Let there be Skrilla," and there was Skrilla. Contests, separating CSGO from League of Legends, and Thorin advertised Alpha Draft, each commercial after its own kind, and Alpha Draft saw all that Thorin had made, and it was very good. Now, if you consider where the Danish scene was last summer, it seemed to be one of the most healthy, vibrant, exciting scenes in the entire world in terms of a national scene, because you had TSM, Team Solomid, the team that is now Astralis. They were one of the best teams in the entire world, a consensus #2 team in the world for a while. Obviously able to beat Fnatic, but not quite take Fnatic's #1 crown. And then even when Envious rose up, they were the #2 team to Envious. They won 5 tournaments over the year. You had Dignitas, the team back then that had Nico still in it and had Pimp and AZ, and this was a top 10 team, and they were challenging, they were finishing top 4 at Gfinity Summer Masters 1, and they were challenging NIP, and they were challenging Envious and very nearly beating them, and this was all very exciting stuff, and you thought, wow, there's some real upset potential there for that team. And then you look even now when there's all these problems in the Danish scene, Astralis is still a top 4 team. Sure, they've choked, they haven't won a tournament in a long time, they made a few finals, but that's about it. This is a team where they're still solid top 4 team. Dignitas still has solid upset potential. I mean, we've seen them beat Envious at Game Show. We've seen them beat NIP and Astralis in best of ones at recent DreamHack Malmö. And you got to consider that this is a scene which still has a lot of potential, a lot of good players within it, but they haven't quite got the right mix. I mean, the mix that was good last year for TSM that made them almost the best team in the world at 2 occasions, it's not working anymore. The mix that's good for Dignitas is still pretty good for upsets, but still don't have quite enough power. So you see all these Danish players in the scene. You've got to ask yourself, how can we make the best team out of this? How can we make a team that could legitimately be the best team in the world? Because what's crazy is when TSM was on top, you actually could look at their team, and what made them so dangerous and so powerful is that they were so versatile and so well-rounded, because they had pretty much, at the time, the best Danish player for every position. You could reasonably say that. Sure, when AZ rose up, you could say in theory, he's like one of the best players and better than certain players in Dignitas, in TSM, like Carrigan, but by position and role of what you need for a player, at the time, players like Device, KGB were better than what AZ was for his role. So it wouldn't be unreasonable at the time to say it. That's obviously not the case anymore. And actually, that's why I want to make this video. Because in a lot of the other videos I've made, sure, like for example, the French one really is sort of like, how could you fix Envious? Because they were in a lot of trouble. They're building the French super team. So this video, in a sense, is how do you fix Astralis? But we're going to call it just building a Danish super team to make it a more neutral title. So essentially, we're going to start with Astralis' team. We're going to take their 5-man roster because they've got all the money. We've heard them brag. They've got $9,000 salaries each. They even have ownership over the company, which obviously might be an issue in terms of roster changes, but eventually roster changes have to come, and it means that they themselves would get to vote on it, and org couldn't like overrule them because they are the org. They've got obviously some of the best players still, not only in Denmark, but in the world. So you'd want to start with the Astralis core. They've got players, more importantly, that have the prestige and the skill level where other players in Denmark would want to play with them and would accept the offer, not just because of the money, not just because of the good players, but because these are players people want to play with. And finally, there's the prestige that this has been the best org. I mean, obviously, it's been in different organizations, but the best core team within Denmark for a number of years now has made it deep in majors. And these other Danish players will want to be a part of what you could accomplish with a team like this, you'd imagine. So let's start with Astralis, and there's actually 3 players from the Astralis lineup at the moment that I'm going to keep, and I'm not going to throw out, and we're going to make this the core that we're going to build the Danish super team from. So the first player, it's going to be an obvious one if you've followed many of my videos, because it's Device. Now, this guy is not only a star player, not only one of the best players in the world, but he's very well-rounded as a player. He has fantastic rifles, has very good pistols, it's amazing with the SMGs, and he's also one of the best AWPers for a guy who's a main rifler. Now, the problem is they've tried to make him a main AWPer in this team, which hasn't quite worked, because on every map, on every half, and in every situation where you have 4750, Device isn't always suited to be AWPing there. And in fact, it takes away some of his versatility, where he will be better with a rifle in some of these situations. But he's an AWPer where he does AWP quite a lot. Like, he actually AWPs more than someone like Olofmeister does. So you look at those guys out there, KGB, Olofmeister, the only one really out of the guys who's like a main rifle who also AWPs. There's only really simple AWPs more than Device out. Those superstar players who can do both. Beyond that, you're looking at guys who are real primary AWPers. Kenny S, Kenny S. Guardian, JDM. Yeah, obviously those guys use the AWP more, but they're not as much riflers. So to me, Device has incredible talent, and if you apply it properly, he can definitely be your star player, definitely carry the team, as we saw in autumn of last year, when he'd gotten over all the choking issues. Not only has his team won tournaments in the summer, but now he was like a guaranteed 20 frag guy every map, it felt like. No matter what the circumstances, no matter what the opponent, no matter if his team was losing, he was always going to be consistent in his output, and he wasn't having underperformances. His team sometimes were losing because they weren't as good, or they were playing fantastic opponents that just edged them, like when Envious beat them a bunch of times. It's also worth saying that he hasn't choked every time, even in this little downswing where Stars went from being like a top 2, top 3 team to like a 4th or 5th best team. He hasn't choked every time then. He has sometimes, like, but you think of some recent occasions that they choked. Okay, so obviously the MLG semi-finals, a pretty obvious one, versus Na'Vi, where they lost 0-2. Well, on map 1, Inferno, he was one of the main reasons why they got that game to 14-14, and he was playing pretty well, except for on that last round, where, yeah, he missed some shots, but that was also some communication issues within his team. Then you look, the series against NIP, they decided to get out of the group at DreamHack Malmö. Well, this wasn't Device choking. This guy was actually very good on 2 of the maps. And particularly on the deciding map, Trading was one of the only reasons they were even in that game still. So yeah, he still does choke sometimes, but it's not only him choking, and it's not him choking all the time that is holding Astralis back. So he's worth the gamble in terms of his skill level and what he's capable of. If you put him in right situations, I think he'd be more effective. And more importantly, he's not just going to choke all the time, though choking is an issue still for him. But more importantly, when the team chokes, he's not the only one who chokes, and it's not always him who chokes. That's worth pointing out as a distinction. I always emphasize when he chokes, because to me, he is such a fantastic player, so well-rounded, so skilled, that he's someone where I feel like if he can just get even 5 to 10% more performance in terms of less choking in a game, he'll start winning some of these games from regardless of what's going on elsewhere in the team, and he'll win some of these matches, and they'll start winning more tournaments. So yeah, it'd be nice if every other aspect of the team could get fixed, as we're going to try to in this video, but that's one thing where if he himself could work on that, he could start to put the team in a winning position again, single-handedly. That's how talented the guy is. It's also worth pointing out, in terms of making the super team, this guy would never be cut. I mean, imagine a universe in which they cut this guy. Well, first things first, he's going to go straight to either Dignitas or a team like a FaZe or whatever, and either get mad money or be very, very dangerous and batter a team like Astralis from the other team, Dignitas. So there's no way this guy's going to be cut. He's the one guy that will never be cut because of his mad skill level and the level of respect he has from the other Danish players. Now, the second player that I'm going to keep is actually going to be Zipnix. And the reason why is because it's true, he's not performing at the level he was around that autumn period where there was the rumor he was going to be cut, and he wasn't cut, and they didn't bring an AZ, and his level went way up, and he was fantastic at ESL Dubai, etc. No, but this guy is not at that level. He's not a superstar, but for a support, he's still one of the best support players in the world. He's a very stable player, and I think he has a really good personality for the team, because he's not going to be involved in any sort of internal turmoil or fighting or criticizing people. He's just going to try and do his job, and he's going to do what you ask him to do and play the spots you want. So with these two parts, we've got our superstar and we've got our stable support player. This is a really good base to build from. Now, I think my third player that I would keep for this team is Dupree, because Dupree and Device, they are the 1-2 punch, the get right in the forest of the Danish scene. I mean, you have to realize they're still reasonably young guys. It's not like their time's passed. They're still both fantastic players on different ends of the game. I feel like Device is more on the passive side of play and just taking good angles, using his skills. Dupree's obviously more of the aggressive style of play. He's less mad skills in terms of like precision and accuracy with the weapon, but he's more of an explosive player, and he does more work on the T side. I think of Device is more of a CT-sided player overall. Although if you put an AK in his hands on the T side and put him in the right spot, then middle around, sort of middle of the pack, I think you could get a lot more done. So Dupree, when the team is at their best, when they are at their most powerful, is when Dupree is really going off. Like Device, as I told you last year, they could be losing and he was very consistent. But when Dupree joins him as that second star, this is when this team's always been really electrifying. Very, very dynamic team. Because he's a guy where his explosive T-sides can just win a game outright. I mean, you think of the PGL Season 1 final where they beat Virtus Pro, and they beat them on Virtus Pro's maps, and they were phenomenal there, and he was a big reason as to why. Joining Device is one of the best players in the tournament. Then you think of that MLG quarterfinal recently, the major, Columbus, and he was the guy who was bodying Fnatic, utterly crushing these guys with monster play. And so, yeah, he has had certainly he's had a slump over the last few months, but when he has his shit together and he's paired with Device, I feel like that's the combo right there in terms of your star power. Now, there's also the social aspect. He's been in the team for so long. He seems to be like one of the more vocal voices within the team that people listen to. Again, I don't think he would be cut. So there's my 3 players that I would have from the Astralis team to make my core. So now the question is, what am I doing cutting Cajun B and Carrigan, right? Because I've just essentially implied they're not in the team, and they're not. So the reason why I'm cutting Cajun is, even though he's a very skilled player, it's so niche the way he's skilled that I feel like it's not reliable at the moment. It was very good when they were one of the best teams in the world in the Envious era, but I don't feel like it quite lives up to what it needs to be right now. First of all, he has recently, the last tournament or so, come out of his slump, because he was in a bad slump towards the end of last year and early this year. But even so, he actually has big issues in big games. And everyone focuses on Device, or when Dupree has a dog shit game like against Nip in Malmo, it's easy to look at those players. But actually, I've seen in a lot of their big games where they fail, Cajun B just kind of disappears. And you think of Cajun B, he's the guy who's supposed to go be like absolutely crazy and go a huge explosive game of like 25 frags, crazy AWPing, big time firepower from this guy, and he has these quiet games where he's just okay, and he doesn't do much, and he seems to be more hesitant, doesn't take his shots, and misses the shots that normally he hits. This is a guy who's really struggled in big games as well, I feel. Also, you've got to consider, unfortunately, his very, very strong niche that made them the best team in the world at one point in time, in my opinion, going into the major, was on Dust 2. That was his map. They played him on CT side. They had this static setup with him at the car with an AWP where he was fantastic, and he would hit those shots every time, and they couldn't be stopped. It's now been neutralized. People are beating them routinely on that, the elite teams we're talking about, and they no longer can make that a home map, and they're having their issues on CT side as well. So I don't feel as though his strengths really play to what's going on, or rather his strengths don't exist as much and have been nullified and neutralized to some degree within Astralis. So unfortunately, I'd have to kick Cajun out. Even though I like the guy, I think he's a good player, but we're talking about trying to make the best possible team here and trying to make a team that'll work. So for right now, I don't think it's working that well with him in the team, especially not in these big clutch games and against the elite teams that have players as good as him. So I feel like we have to make room for someone to get in some other firepower, some other stars. So it has to be Cajun B's my star to go. Now, interestingly, I'm going to cut Carrigan. Now, this is the guy where up until late last year, I would have never considered cutting this guy. I think he turned the team around. He really designed a good structure that was actually quite versatile as a team approach, where they had tactics and they had anti-strats and they had set smokes and stuff, but they would still within that allow the stars breathing room and allow them chances to make individual plays and have some autonomy. And I think that freedom, when it worked, that breathing space was what made them so fantastic and so hard for teams like Fnatic and the other teams out there to even battle with and try and beat. So, unfortunately, that's not the case anymore. So, first and foremost, Carrigan, aside from that first tournament, that CCS, the PGL Championship kickoff season or whatever it was called, aside from that tournament, he hasn't been that sick individually on any kind of consistent basis. He went quite back down early on, but he's never supposed to be. He wasn't supposed to be a big fragger. He's just the in-game leader. Unfortunately, now we've heard he's apparently got some sort of hand issues. This guy's been very poor individually, I thought, over the last 3 to 5 months. He's really had his issues, and yeah, the other stars have had their issues, so it's emphasised it, but he's been playing much worse than he was in the past, and he doesn't really have a niche individually within the team, it feels, anymore. Also, unfortunately, even though I think he is a good in-game leader, it feels like the team doesn't listen to him anymore. He doesn't have their ear in the same way. They don't buy into his system as much because it hasn't worked. So even if you're a good in-game leader, I always say it's about football coaches and coaches in basketball and managers. You might be a fantastic manager and coach, and it might even be for this team, but if you don't have the team's ear, then they're not going to listen to you, they're not going to buy into it. So you're not the right coach in that scenario, even though you're a good coach. So this is the problem. I feel like the team don't listen to him. They need a fresh voice. There's also the fact that I feel like he can't maximize the skills and strength and style of Astralis because in pick ban, the team doesn't have too much faith in him, or they're overruling him, or they want more of a democratic process, and therefore he can't do, because this is a guy who could pick the very smart pick and ban. I've talked to him many times, and pick the map that on paper they should be the strongest on and the weakest for the opponent and make the right gambles, and his team just won't do this. They won't do that. They want to play the maps that they just feel comfortable on, and they're willing to play opponents on maps that the opponent's strong on as long as they feel comfortable on, and it's just a train wreck. So unfortunately, I feel like a lot of the positives he brought to the team don't exist there anymore. As an aside, he's also much older than all the other players I'm considering here, and all the other young players out there in Denmark. Actually, Cajun B and Carrigan are the two oldest. They're both 26 years old. All the other players we're talking about are like between 17 and 23. So there's a lot of younger players out there. Now I've removed Cajun B and Carrigan, who am I going to plug in their spots? There are 2 names that stick out that are obvious to me to fill these roles. But I've got 4 names overall we're going to consider. So the first name, and I would go with this guy right now, is I would put Kjærby into Cajun B's spot. Now, Kjærby is only 17 years old, but he is, in the last sort of 4 or so months, this guy has become a big-time fragger. DreamHack Open Leipzig, ESL Barcelona exhibition, DreamHack Malmö. This guy was a monster in most of the maps at these tournaments. He's finally gotten over those problems. This guy used to be the guy where online he was very good in 2015. He'd have the odd map in a group stage where he was decent, but he never had those star performances. He never lived up to the hype of a very skilled player, and he seemed to choke under pressure himself. He's gotten over that. I mean, you look at Malmö, their whole team just fell apart against Envious in that quarterfinals. He didn't. He was a fucking man, and he was playing like a guy who wanted to win that match no matter what was going on in his team, and just kept plugging away and kept fighting and kept battling, and you've got to admire that. So he's a guy who now does perform under pressure more often than not. Yes, he did flunk Copenhagen Games, a very easy tournament that Dignitas certainly should have been able to win, but that was one tournament out of like 4 this year. So I've got to say right now, this guy's really good on LAN. He's gotten over a lot of the pressure issues, and when I think of some of the choking issues that they had with Cajun and Device in the team Astralis, if I'm removing Cajun and I'm putting Kirby in his spot now, yeah, Kirby's not going to AWP, but Kirby's going to be a guy who can perform under pressure, and hopefully in this team that would take away more of the issue there. So when the Device then doesn't choke, now we've got no chokers in the team in theory, and now we can have Kirby come in with some big firepower, and we've got a solid big 3 again of Device, Dupree and Kirby, and then go off at different times. And I think that's a very nice core to go with right there, assuming he could live up to the pressure of being in Astralis. So that would be my first edition, the obvious one for me right now. Now, in terms of people who can also play that spot, I'm going to go through 2 other names, but right now I'm not considering these 2. Like, these wouldn't be my picks. My pick would be Kirby there, and obviously I'm going to pick an in-game leader. So for the other spot that was the Kirby spot, the other 2 people you have to consider is AZ and Config. Now, AZ is actually pretty young as well. He's only 19. So he's a guy who still has some potential. He's a guy where we have to remember when he was in Dignitas, he was doing what Kirby's doing now, where Dignitas was terrible at the major, and as in Cluj-Napoca and Sivo Pro Season 8 finals, but he was a monster there. Then, unfortunately, he thought he got out of prison. He went off to FaZe in G2, and he's just been good there to okay. He hasn't been that monster. He hasn't been that sick player doing what Kirby's doing now. He's just been an okay player for whatever reasons, whether it's lackluster in that team and people don't care and they don't have any direction, they don't practice. Who knows what it is, but he hasn't shown that form again. So unfortunately, that's why I'd give Kirby the nod over him, even though I thought AZ was a monster late last year and had one of the best rounds I've ever seen in CSGO. That round where he just demolished Virtus Pro on Inferno with a deagle and had like 1 M4 kill. I'll try linking it up there if I can find a clip of it. So I think he certainly has star potential, but he hasn't shown me it recently, and so I wouldn't go with him right now. Even though I think, obviously, if they were to make a change in Astralis, they'd at least consider this guy if they could afford him and get him out of his contract in FaZe, which obviously is for a lot of money. The other player is Config. Now, the problem I have here is he only has occasional maps where he's very good. He hasn't had whole tournaments, I thought, where he was really that good. He had one, which was like the game show one. Oh, yeah, okay, that was all right. And that was also one of the other tournaments where Kirby was just decent and not sick. But aside from that, yeah, he hasn't really done that much. Like, he had the odd map at DreamHack Malmö, but then he disappeared completely in the round of 8. Now, he's obviously a guy who has potential for the future, and because he is a young guy, and he's new to the top tier scene. Unfortunately, I mean, this is a player as well where it reminds me of the Devil pickup, where I wonder if sometimes he's not being used in the right role for him, or he's been forced into a position because of who he replaced in Dignitas, and Dignitas has a system already for the other players. I wonder if you could put him in different spots and make him more effective. But for right now, I wouldn't pick him up for that reason. He seems like he has some issues under pressure, and he's not performing on LAN the way he is online. And also, there's all that whole shady shit around him, so we have to kind of see how that resolves itself. So now, the last name I'm going to consider is someone I would have in this team. If I'm going to take Carragher out, the obvious person I have to put in is MSL. Now, MSL, amazingly, because he obviously looks like he's a guy who's like, he looks like he's like 26 years old with 2 kids, and he's like, he looks so stressed at every event, like he's just come home from working fucking 10 hours a day at some mega high pressure job. He's actually only 21 years old, believe it or not. This is a guy who has a decent history in CSGO. Early 2013, he was the support player of the Western Wolves team. That was actually at one point in time like a 2nd or 3rd best team in the world, challenging an IP, making 2 straight international finals, beating out teams like Very Games. This is a guy where he has the history. He's played in a lot of matches, a lot of LANs, and he's learned how to become a good in-game leader. He's become a good tactician, and I think at the moment, in terms of what he's getting done in the server, he is the best tactician in Denmark. So if we want proper tactics and we want a guy to be a new, fresh voice that the players might listen to, he seems like the obvious choice. He also can AWP a little bit. So if we want Device to only AWP in the spots and the sides and the maps that make sense for him, MSL can do a utility standard AWP at other certain spots as well, and we can have that going. And we can have a dual AWP, obviously. I still don't like him that much on the AWP, but whatever, it can work. Now, those are the players I would include. What's worth saying about the Danish scene is that the Danish scene, yeah, okay, so the French scene's a clusterfuck. The problem they have there is loads of those players are quite old and are long in the tooth in terms of how long they've played. The Danish scene has got a lot of potential, not just in terms of the number of players they have, but they're so young. I mean, you consider some of these names. Look at this. We've got Kirby, 17, AZ, 19, Device 20, Zipnik's 20. Now, Dupree's actually reasonably old compared to him. He's 23. But, okay, KGB and Carragher are 26. But we've got some pretty young guys here. MSL, 21. We've got guys who can be playing for like 5, 6 more years. Longer in some cases. But 4, 5, 6 more years. The window for them to make a very good team out of these players is still very much present. So there's still a lot of time for this to get fixed. If you were to put together the best team, I think it could be like the TSM team of last year. And it could be potentially the best team in the world because they have the position, they have all the roles covered essentially if they have the right picks there. I also do think that people have always underrated Astralis when they were TSM. They always underrated them because, I mean, consider this fact. They won 5 tournaments last year. That's a lot of tournaments to win. And sure, Envious won more, but that was only with two different lineups. Yeah, Fnatic won more. They were the best team of all time. Beyond those teams, you look at teams like Virtus.pro and Astralis, and they have one similar amount of events, but Astralis' events that they won were way more impressive. These were big-time international competitions. So first of all, they won 5 tournaments. Then they finished top 4 16 times in 2015. Now, to put that in context, Fnatic, even including the Danish lineup, so the best team of all time, and then the Danish lineup that won the last 3 events of the year, only finished top 4 19 times. So not only does that show how incredible Astralis is, but also shows how much they underachieved, that they only won 5 tournaments out of that, whereas Fnatic won like 15 out of that 19 or something crazy. Now, with this lineup, so since Carrigan joined, so about the last 16 months or so, this team has finished top 4 22 times. People always underrated this team. Yeah, it had its issues. It certainly choked. It had their issues in certain matchups. Like, even though they were a favourite over Fnatic for a while, now Fnatic seem like they always... Well, I guess they don't because they beat Fnatic the last time. It wasn't really with Olafmeister. In theory, the modern Fnatic beats them. Also, now Na'Vi beats them, where they used to beat Na'Vi in the past. And now Envious, at least the last few times, has beaten them. Not sure how they work against Virtus.pro, but that Virtus.pro's dropped off a lot, obviously. So, they've still got the pieces to be very good, but you need to do some tweaks, I think. And for me, this is the Danish super team that I would build.